friends, it's Sam from DIY Hunters and I am so excited for another shed shop update. Last time I gave you guys a shed shop update, it was to show you how I made that DIY concrete accent wall, which I still am like totally obsessed with. And in today's video, I'm gonna show you how I installed some waterproof vinyl plank flooring. This is my first time ever installing vinyl plank flooring and it was way easier than I thought it would be. So I figured why not make an entire video dedicated to the process in case somebody else wants to install a similar product in their home or their workshop. I'm pretty floored with how this turned out. Sorry. I should not be allowed to sit in front of a camera with a microphone. So with that being said, let's get started. Friends, I'm so excited because as you can see, Mother Nature blessed me with a snow day. So I am off my full-time job today and that is great because that means shop time. So I'm hoping that by the time I publish this video, this will be done. But because I'm waiting on the rest of the cement to be delivered to finish this wall, I figured this is a great time to start on something super exciting. The flooring. I cannot wait, and I feel like this is the perfect time to do some work, so let's get started. Okay, story time. So when I first built this workshop 2.5 years ago, I really wanted the floor to look like textured concrete. Ironic, yes, I know, because now my wall looks like textured concrete, but I ended up using a textured decking paint over the plywood floor. Now, this worked really, really well for 2.5 years, but it's seriously gotten so beaten up, and I decided that it's time for something way more durable in this shed shop. So after like kicking around a couple of ideas for what I wanted my floor to finally look like, I was actually super inspired by my girl DIY Danny, who is amazing because she just put beautiful laminate flooring in her shed workshop. And after seeing that, I was like, man, I definitely want something that looks like wood on the floor of this shop. And after going to my local Home Depot and looking at a couple of options, I ended up opting for a waterproof vinyl plank flooring for my shop that was this like beautiful shade of gray. And even cooler, I was able to partner up with my friends at the Home Depot to show you how easy it was to install this product. So there were definitely a couple reasons why I chose waterproof vinyl plank flooring. First and foremost, they already came with an underlayment attached to the bottom of each board, which meant that I could just install it directly over the plywood floors. Secondly, they were a click and lock system and tongue and groove system, which makes installing them so super easy. And because they are waterproof and rigid, I know that they're going to be able to stand the test of time in this workshop because there is a lot that happens in here. Now, to get started with installation, I actually did purchase a whole installation kit, which made this project so much easier. Highly recommend it. I've actually linked that along with every product I used for this project on my website. You can find that by clicking on the link below this video. But once I had followed the installation directions in there, which told me to add some 1/4 inch spacers to the back wall where I was starting, I then had to make sure that my entire first row of boards was cut so that they were flush to the wall, which meant cutting off the tongue of these boards. To do this, I ended up using my circular saw and a track. Definitely overkill. You can use a razor blade. I was just being very impatient. I'm also going to show you another method for cutting these boards later that was also so much easier, but for me, this worked great. So after cutting that tongue portion away from the first row of boards, I then bumped them up against those spacers, starting from the left back corner of my workshop, working my way across and then moving up towards the front of my workshop. It's actually recommended to cut the tongue off of the first row of boards because this just helps to avoid any problems with the expansion gap over time. Another thing that I really had to keep in mind here was that the first row is really like the most important because if you have a crooked first row, then the rest of the flooring is going to be crooked. So I just spent a lot of time here making sure that all the gaps were correct on the back side of the boards, on the sides of the boards, and that everything was perfectly straight. When it came time to end the row, I measured how big I needed my piece to be, and then I cut that piece out using a razor blade. Now you can definitely use a razor blade. Again, I'm super impatient, so I ended up switching over to a handheld saw after this. But if you don't have a saw, I did want to show that you can definitely easily do this project just using a straight edge razor. Also, definitely make sure to measure multiple times here because you want to make sure that you are cutting the correct side of the piece. So if the piece before has a groove, then you want the next piece to have a tongue because the tongue has to go into that groove. But after tightening everything up and double, triple, quadruple, a millionth checking that everything was straight on that first row, I then used the offcut piece from the piece I cut to end the first row to then start the next row. I also used a block that came with the installation kit to tap everything tightly into place. Now here's where things kind of got a little tricky, because here's where you're gonna have to like find yourself getting into a groove when you're installing flooring. Basically, I found it was easiest to install the smaller side first, slightly lift the entire board and a little bit of the other part of the row, get that into the groove of the board in front of it, and then snap it all into place. Use the block to tap it into place, and then also use the hammer to make sure that the seams were nice and tight. Another thing I want to mention here, I don't know if I did before, I might have, but I also made sure that I had a pretty decent gap on both ends of the rows as well, and this is going to help limit any issues with expansion later. Okay, so this is the part of the project where I was already annoyed with using the razor blade. Yes, it only took me like 2 rows to figure out this method was not going to work for me. So I decided to actually switch on over to my Dremel Ultra saw. It's just a handheld circular saw that's super compact, and it's also cordless, and it cuts beautifully, and I decided to basically use this saw for the rest of this project. Even cooler actually, if you don't trust yourself being able to cut straight, it also has a guide that it comes with to help you make straight cuts, so I highly recommend this saw in particular if you are doing a project like this in your home. But as always, you can find the link to that and the rest of the materials for this project on my website by clicking on the link below this video. So a couple of things that I definitely learned doing this project are A, if you have trim work anywhere in your house, you definitely want to remove all of that trim or anything that may get in the way of the flooring before you start your project. So that's first. Second, and probably maybe most important before you start this project, is you want to make sure that your floors are level. So luckily the floors in my shop are still level, because luckily my dad and I built this shed to last. So I didn't really have too many issues with the flooring having to like be leveled at all. There are definitely a ton of YouTube videos on how to level your floor if you are about to install a floating floor and you are concerned that it may not be level, so definitely check that out before you start a project like this one. Also, if you don't want your knees to scream at you, which is pretty much what my knees were doing after working on these first couple of rows, you will definitely want to get yourself some knee pads. They are probably the most underrated tool for a project such as this. Unfortunately, mine were like locked in one of my workbenches because my workbenches were just kind of piled in front of one another. So as soon as I was able to have enough rows to get my workbenches back on that back wall, I immediately dove into that top drawer to get my knee pads. Oh, also, so forgot to mention, I actually removed the spacers from that back wall before moving the workbenches into place. The workbenches were awesome because they were heavy enough to hold the floor down so it didn't shift during the rest of the installation. So once I was suited up, I then began to continue working on the rows of flooring, and unfortunately, because my space is so tight, I kind of had to like work on a few rows, then move things around, then work on a few rows, then move things around, and it was kind of annoying. I definitely learned the hard way though in moving things around that the exposed tongue and groove portions of these boards were very fragile, and I ended up breaking a couple of them and then having to like replace certain boards in the last row after moving things around. Luckily, I used the project calculator on Home Depot's website when I purchased this product, and I did purchase about 20% more than I needed, so I ended up being okay, but it's definitely easy to run out when you are breaking boards, so my best advice is if you're moving things around while working, just be super careful. Okay, so in terms of timing, I did have to work on this floor occasionally on afternoons and evenings after my full-time job. So all in all, this floor took me about 4 afternoons to finish, which really wasn't so bad in hindsight. I feel like it just felt like it took longer because I had to like wait in between each portion of the floor that I worked on. Luckily though, having to wait so long to finish the floor meant that the snow was finally gone and I could have my shop doors open to work on those last few rows, which ended up being pretty tight. In order to basically finish those back rows, because it was super tight, I just worked my way all the way until I could no longer fit a full piece. And then once I had gotten to that portion of the wall, I measured exactly how much I needed in the shape that I needed, and then transferred those measurements over to a fresh piece of flooring. For this last row, it was super important to leave the side with the tongue intact, unlike the first pieces that we installed, because the tongue will have to go into the groove of the previous board, and then eventually everything will kind of just be locked into place and then set into place using the final trim pieces for the end of the room or for the doorway. And Dremel Ultra Soft for the win for these cuts. This thing was a serious time saver. Now, once that last piece was cut, I then clicked it right into place the same exact way I did with all of the other flooring for this project, and I then tapped it into place using the small pry bar that came with the installation kit before moving on to installing the other boards in that last row the same exact way. Now, normally in a project such as this one, you'd get to the last row of flooring, you're like, yes, oh my gosh, I'm almost done, this is awesome, but I could not get excited yet because I did have to order a brand new threshold for the shed doors from Home Depot's website. Unfortunately, it was taking a little longer to ship because we just had some crazy weather recently. So instead of just stopping the project at this point, I actually then added all of the trim work back to the walls, and then I did have to wait a couple more days for that threshold to be delivered. It's here. So the threshold that I ordered for my shed doors was obviously metal, and it was way too long, so I had to cut it down to size, and I did this by marking where I needed to make my cut and then cutting the metal using my Dremel rotary tool and a metal cutting attachment. And once it was cut down to size, I then brought it on over to my shed doors, removed any of the older seals that I had going on that shed door, because I definitely have installed a couple over the years. I cleaned up everything super nice, and then I also made sure to add a bead of caulking, silicone caulking, to the top portion of where the threshold was going and also into the bottom, so that no water can kind of like seep through and underneath that threshold. Although the threshold fit like pretty much perfectly once it was in place, and although it was like kind of secure with the silicone, I did want to just kind of screw it into place to make sure that it did not move at all, especially since I do tend to roll my tools in and out of my workshop. So I did this by just pre-drilling and countersinking some stainless steel screws into the threshold at a couple of different spots, and now it's really secure and it's not going anywhere. It also looks so good, and I am like low-key freaking out about how awesome this shop is starting to look. I cannot believe that it took me 2.5 years to finally find a flooring solution that I am actually genuinely happy about in this workshop, but I am so excited to see how this floor holds up over time, and I'm also really excited to be able to have a surface to clean super easily. And yes, I purposefully spilled a lot of coffee on my shop floors because I was so excited to show you guys how much easier it is to clean up than my old flooring option was. So although this shed shop makeover is taking way longer than I originally anticipated, I'm so excited to be making any progress at all in here, and it's really starting to look so amazing. And now that the floor and that back wall is done, I can start moving on to some other projects in this space, like a miter saw station, hint hint, wink wink. But either way, I do hope that you will stick around for those projects as well as the rest of the updates that I have planned in this shed shop. But in the meantime, friends, as always, thank you for being epically awesome. And until next time, friends, happy DIYing.